BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Kirsty Wark. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. Enjoy. Hello. My guests today are all qualified in their own way to discuss what should be done in the long term to combat so-called Islamic State. Each of them is involved with a different aspect of the ongoing battle to counter IS, the most sophisticated and well-funded terror organisation in modern times. And what should happen to thousands of foreign IS women and their children in refugee camps, some of them run by the Kurds, with no help from governments whose nationals they shelter, of whom Shamima Begum is but one. Asad Judi, a British national and a Kurd, and a former Iranian army conscript, returned to his homeland to help build a new Kurdistan and found himself using his military skills as a sniper against IS, racking up 250 kills. In his book Long Shot, he tells us in vivid detail how, against all the odds, women and men of the Kurdish military led the long fight to push IS out, and about the toll it took on him. Joana Cook, a senior research fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation, is right now updating a major report on women's involvement with IS. She says the West has dangerously old-fashioned ideas about female IS affiliates. Claire Foster-Gilbert, the director of the Westminster Abbey Institute, will argue that we should restore the idea of moral purpose to our institutions, like government, like police and parliament, and not shy away from the word morality, thinking it sounds pompous. Individual actions, however intended to bring about justice, will always be partial. That is in no way to decry the extraordinary humanity of our fourth guest, War Doctor David Knott, whose most recent work was in Syria, trying to save men, women and children attacked by both Assad and IS. His new book, War Doctor, Surgery on the Frontline, is out now. Welcome to you all. First of all, David, can we go right back to the impetus for you as a war doctor? As if work in the NHS wasn't hard enough, you actively chose to use your skills as a war doctor.
Yes, I was always very interested in war right from a very early age. Certainly my father was, he really wanted to, he was in the Japanese Second World War, he escaped from Burma, and he filled me with stories non-stop of how it was. And he wanted to work for the UN, he wanted to, and I think what he did, he put all his thoughts into helping me adjust my mind to perhaps go and help people abroad. And he had a massive impetus to try and do that for me.
And when you were a young doctor then, so it was always in the back of your mind, so where did you start as a war doctor?
So I started right when I became a consultant back in Charing Cross in 1993 in November, and a month later I decided to abandon my NHS job for a short period of time and work in Sarajevo as a war doctor.
But it'd be fair to say you actually knew nothing of what that would absolutely involve.
Absolutely. I was green round the gills. I had no idea what it was like to do trauma. I wasn't a trained trauma surgeon, but I knew I just wanted to go and help people. I watched something on the television. There was lots of media reports on the telly about people trying to find their children, and when they found them, they took them to the hospital. There was no doctor there. And watching this had this massive fire going off in my heart that I wanted to go and help. And that's the reason why I went.
And in a way, the thread that's run right through all this is the fact that you've been learning all the way. But in the beginning in Sarajevo, had you ever done an amputation before? I
had. I mean, I was a trained vascular surgeon, but I hadn't done an amputation where it involved blast injuries, which are enormous injuries, which cause huge amount of degree of energy exposure onto the body. So you get other conditions for head and chest and people and things like that. So not only do you deal with the trauma of the injury itself, but you've got the blast waves that go into the chest and causing problems with that as well. So it's a completely different ball game.
All that, of course, led in many ways through different countries to your ongoing involvement in Syria, which you call since 2012 the thread. Explain your relationship with Syria and doctors there.
So I went with Médecins Sans Frontières in 2012. We worked in a house which was converted into a hospital, and it was right at the start of the war, and we were dealing with the Free Syrian Army, we were dealing with rocket attacks, we were dealing with lots of explosions and gunshot wounds and so on. And then in 2013 I worked with somebody who I met at MSF Hospital in 2012, who said to me, well, why don't you come and work with us with Syria Relief? And that was the beginning, really, of a love affair which I began with the Syrian doctors. I went to work with them in 2013 in Aleppo. Of course, when you go to these war zones, the doctors, the senior doctors all leave, so you're left then with very junior doctors.
And you're operating in dreadful circumstances, under attack and so forth, and also even yourself going out is an impossibility. Your identity was an impossibility too. How did that work?
Well, because you have to cross the border with a different name, and so you adopt a different sort of identity, so nobody knows who you are. You don't go with your passport because you just cross the border, and so in one respect you're going there as somebody just to help, but you can't help because at that time the Syrian government didn't allow people to go across, and so you basically had to go in quietly under the wire, and certainly not with any of your implements. Absolutely. So all the implements that were there were already there, and there were lots of motorbikes with bringing in surgical equipment and so on for us.
You said that this is in the book. You write about this really being the worst conflict that you've ever had to deal with, and I wonder, in particular instances, we're going to obviously hear from Assad in a moment about the role of a sniper, but you saw the enormous cruelty of snipers. What happened?
So I was in Aleppo in 2013, and we would receive probably about 12 to 14 gunshot wounds a day, and these were all from snipers around the city, and there's probably about 72 snipers dotted all around East Aleppo, and they'd be picking people off all the time. And not only just they wouldn't be shooting Free Syrian Army, they'd be shooting civilians. So every person almost we dealt with was a civilian, and they were children shot in the leg and the chest and the arm. They were
pregnant women.
They were all adults and old men and old women. But not only that, occasionally we had sort of pregnant women that were shot in the abdomen as well. And occasionally, when I would watch them, there would be about 4 or 5 sometimes during the day where we'd have all people shot in one side of the chest, say the shoulder, on the left shoulder, another in the right shoulder, sometimes in the right leg and the left leg. It became to me, and I asked the doctors there, this is very unusual because we're seeing a sort of regular pattern of gunshot wounds. Why is it that one day we're seeing gunshot wounds to the left leg and nothing else? And he said, well, there's probably a game going on. And of course, what do you mean there's a game going on? Well, maybe they're receiving packets of cigarettes for how many they shoot on one side. I said, well, that's ridiculous, I thought. However, as time was going on, it did appear to me that there was something going on, and we did have even pregnant women that were shot in the abdomen, and you can always tell a pregnant woman with their coat on. And why would somebody shoot somebody at the side through their uterus?
So, you eventually made contact with Assad.
I did, right at the very end of in 2016, when all these doctors that I had trained, they became my friends. We became one big family, and because of communication with WhatsApp and social media, they were communicating me every day about, David, help us, please help us. The UN can't help us, America can't help us, nobody can help us. And they were getting down into this very small area in Aleppo, East Aleppo, when the regime was coming in, the Russians were bombing them all the time. So I then decided that I had to do something about it, because they were desperate, absolutely desperate. And in 1993, right at the beginning of my consultant career, I'd met Bashar al-Assad at the Western Eye Hospital when he was an ophthalmic SHO. And I remember talking to him saying that, do you remember, my father has a Syrian surgeon called Dr. Borak, who's a very good orthopaedic registrar, and he didn't know him. And I actually didn't know who this chap was. Then the penny dropped years later that it was Bashar al-Assad. And then through a very circuitous route, I got his telephone number to his presidential palace and was able to phone him to plead for my doctors.
And he was listening?
And he was listening.
You knew he was there, but he wasn't actually on the telephone?
I knew he was there. There was about 12 people there in his office, and I knew he was there. The General said he was there, and at the end of it, he came on the phone and said, "Thank you very much." So yes. I knew it was him.
But, what you were doing was, you were urging him to think about the Hippocratic Oath. I was
saying to him, "You're a doctor."
And, and they were bombing women and kids the whole time.
Yeah. Well, it was the final flick of the dice, really, because I thought, if he doesn't realise that he could make something out of this by once in his lifetime being a bit humanitarian and helping these people to escape. All this
took its toll on you, and you suffered a breakdown. What happened?
I think it was a matter that I had met Ellie, who I was in love with.
Wife.
Yes, and it was a matter of being torn between lots of things, and having been in the worst possible environment at that time, because in Aleppo, October 2014, not only was I deep in Syria, but also there were the problems with Alan Henning, James Foley, just a few tens of kilometres away, who were being, we know what happened to them with ISIS. And I was watching this on the television. I was watching what was going on, not on the television, on Wi-Fi. Every morning I would look, and I got to the stage where I became obsessed with what was going on. And when I came back, it all became a bit too much.
I do want to bring the others in, but the Queen seemed to understand, because you sat beside her at dinner, and she understood you were upset.
Yeah, I mean, a week later I came back from Aleppo, and I was filled with horrible pictures of children being barrel bombed and people being killed, and it was all civilians and children by that time. And of course the ISIS with the beheadings and so on, and then a week later I was sitting with the Queen, and she asked me where I'd just come from, and I said, well, I'd just come from Aleppo. And of course the bottom lip started to go, and I think she appreciated that I was, really seriously stressed, and so we just played with the corgis for half the time of the dinner.
She understood. Asad, you've seen doctors at work, and in most dreadful circumstances trying to help. It's extraordinary work that nurses and doctors from all over the world do.
It is indeed. It is. It's extremely tough, difficult situation to be. You have to be trained for it. You have to know how to use weapon, how to fight. But as a doctor, you are saving lives, and you don't know how to exactly use the weapon. So it's extremely brave, really. Yeah. I have a huge amount of respect for all these doctors, especially doctors and civilians who without having a skill how to use weapon and fight and coming to the front and helping the struggle.
At the moment, and when David's talking about the work in the camps, it's true to say you are going back. You're going to one of the camps?
Yes, next Monday I'm off to Beirut and then off to Lebanon to work in one of the refugee camps on the Syrian-Lebanese border.
And Joanna, from your point of view, when David's there, he helps everybody, whether they're un-de-radicalised IS women and children, just anyone that's there. And I suppose it's that idea that doctors have to really be able to help anybody.
Absolutely. And I think, when we're looking at Syria and Iraq today and conversations about how to manage ISIS returnees and everything, a lot of the conversation today still misses the fact that the biggest victims in this entire period have been the people of Iraq and Syria, and the kind of support that not only doctors have provided, but the international community, like the work that has been done by the soldiers on the front line here. It's the people of Iraq and Syria have been the biggest victims of this entire period. And it's imperative that they receive the kind of support to recover from this.
It's interesting that that you hear government ministers saying it's too dangerous to go into the refugee camps, but journalists are going, and you're going.
Yep, I suppose you have to ask them about that, but yep.
Well, that brings me on to Claire Foster-Gilbert. David made a very difficult and individual decision, a very moral decision. But do you think we shy away from morality and decision making?
I think we probably do, yes, or we shy away from the word. although we're making moral decisions the whole time, perhaps just not consciously, and we could do it more consciously. And certainly if you're responsible for an institution as opposed to an individual responding individually, you still have, you immensely have moral responsibility, but you're not so close to the action, and so it can feel as though the decision is being able to be made in a more perhaps utilitarian way than a more heartfelt way, and the need within governments is to not forget their hearts as they're responding to these situations, nevertheless recognising that they can't down tools and go there. Like I'm sure lots of them would love to do what David did, because that's the really heroic thing. But you've got to be less obviously heroic, but just as morally aware and awake in the decisions that you make and the policies that you develop, sitting at your desk in Whitehall.
And interestingly, at the weekend, morality was invoked by Lord MacDonald, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, when he accused Sajid Javid of moral cowardice over Shamim Begum. That's a pretty big thing to say. But you teach morality to government, to politicians, but to civil servants. So yes. How do you imbue civil servants? I'm not saying they're immoral, but what are you saying to them about morality? You have 3 different moral codes.
Indeed. So what we're absolutely not doing is telling governments how to be government, what their policies should be, and we're not assuming that people don't know the difference between right and wrong, because people do know the difference between right and wrong. What we all need is help in exercising that skill better. So it's a bit like moral Pilates. So you're exercising this moral muscle to be sure that when it comes to the really big and difficult decisions, you're not found wanting. You've got the moral courage available to you. So if you have time, and if you haven't time at the point of the action, then you can reflect on this afterwards. You need to think, what is the action that I'm about to perform, or the policy that's being proposed? What is it trying to achieve? Is the thing it's trying to achieve good and desirable? Be really clear about what it is you're trying to do. And then you have to ask yourself, is the thing that we're going to do in order to achieve this goal going to achieve the goal? Firstly. Secondly, you have to think the thing that we have to do to achieve this goal. Say you're developing a cure for cancer, and the thing that the research that you have to do to develop a cure for cancer is in some way going to harm patients. Well, you have to look at that. And it doesn't matter how important the goal is. If you're going to harm patients, you shouldn't do it. That's the second thing, the duty, the action itself. And then the third thing is you should consider the people most affected by your action. Do they want you to do it? So,
as you say, you're not in any way representing the government, not in local government, but I'm going to ask you the question. If you were going to combat IS long term, it is very important the way that we deal with the women and children.
Yes.
What do you do? What are the moral imperatives?
The first thing is to make sure you know who it is you're working with, understand the nature of the problem. So the work of David, who's been on the front line and met at the work, the communities that Azad has been involved with, and the data that Joana has gathered, the interviews that have been done, really make sure you know what you're dealing with and that you can see it. So often we don't see the issue that we're dealing with, or we see a part of it because we want to come to a conclusion, and it's the world is messy, and you have to allow yourself to see the mess.
But the moral thing to do for the children particularly, and the babies, is one, presumably not separate them from their mothers if at all possible. But the concern is, of course, that the mothers have not been de-radicalised, the older children haven't been de-radicalised, but we cannot leave them there in these camps forever. The governments surely have to have a moral responsibility.
Governments have a moral responsibility. What they should never ever do is make a decision or act out of fear.
That's so interesting. And is that fear of what it will do to them electorally, or fear of what a returning unde-radicalised woman might do?
It could be either of those things. Look, if you're a politician, you have to think about the power that you have. You have to think about your constituents, the people who vote for you. That's the point of democracy, and we need to recognise that politicians do have to think about public opinion. It's not right to say they should just follow their conscience and do what they believe is right, never mind what everybody else thinks, because a democracy means what everybody thinks counts. But that's not the same as as reneging on a decision. You don't want to be. I don't want my politicians to be fearful on my behalf. Perhaps I can put it like that. So we want to call on the best in our electorate to say, we owe a moral responsibility. In my opinion, we owe a moral responsibility to a woman, a child, should I say, a teenager, who is radicalised in this country, to bring her back to face and understand what's happened and to be helped. And all sorts of good things could come out of that, help with other young people who might be radicalised, for example. But the point is that you're not saying, we have no responsibility for you, the borders are around this country, and some kind of false security idea of security is being established. Honestly, that's not going to achieve the goal anyway.
Joanna?
I think Claire raises a very important point about the morals of it, but I guess looking at it from my perspective, I have my PhD in war studies. I look at this from a strategic perspective as well, and I think another part of this conversation, an important one, is the word pragmatism. And we recognize that the number of minors that have been born into this organization to foreign parents and to local parents are incredible right now. So we can, with my colleague Gina Vale, we confirmed at least 566 minors have been born to at least one Western European parent. We know that at least 4,600 minors were taken or have been born into the organization. At least 4,700 women have gone. And so from a pragmatic perspective, if we look at the long-term implications of these categories of persons and the potential roles for them going forward, whether carrying forward the ideology, whether, as we've mentioned, radicalized minors and the kind of support that they require to be rehabilitated and reintegrated into society, all of these are not only moral imperatives, but they become very strategic in the way that this is the moment right now that will really define how this unfolds in the long term.
Yeah. Well, I wonder what you think about that. That international governments have a moral imperative to take back the nationals that went to join IS and their children. Is it better for them to take them back and deal with them? They can't just leave them in refugee camps.
They have to. If you don't, why Kurdish should? Why Kurdish people? We have lost over 4,000 to 5,000 people. Like over 2,000 people are wounded in the battle against ISIS. Our home and our towns were suffered as we suffered. So many people were refugees. They went to other countries. Some they came back to the destroyed houses. We are in very, very weak position.
To look after these people in the camps.
Yeah, we have, if we divide the citizens, which they come from different countries, like, for instance, some countries have 5 ISIS, or some have 200. Some countries
2,000.
have... Yeah, there is, for all these countries, it's much easier to take responsibility for their... they have an institution, they have the resources, we don't.
To take them back. Can I put that to Claire? Because individual countries are dealing in different ways. Russia will take children. France has taken women and many children back. But at the basis of all this is a bigger moral point, which is we are now stepping back and letting Assad rule. The moral imperative to go and fight Assad has gone. David, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that there's no doubt that Assad has won, and he's got backing, and he wouldn't have won had he not had the backing of Russia. And of course, the whole of the reason why IS came into being right at the very beginning is that he let out all the IS from his prisons, and of course, then it became he ran a law that it was anybody that wasn't with the government was a terrorist, and that was the whole reason why he was able to kill so many civilians, that they weren't with the government.
So finally, Claire, the government has just got to give up any moral idea that they can get rid of Assad.
I really can't comment. I'm not going to tell the government what to do.
As an academic.
Things don't go away just because we stop looking at them.
Yeah. Assad, I want to come to you now because you were a Kurdish conscript in the Iranian army and you escaped, and what happened then?
As I escaped, I started getting involved in politics back home in Kurdistan. I was inspired by the revolutionary ideas, by the ideas of freedom, and having been able to speak my language, to wear the dress that I wanted to dress, our traditional Kurdish clothes. And then I worked for a while on that, but then, in Iranian, it's like, it's not much difference between the different religion sectors in Middle East, like in Iran and Turkey and Saudi Arabia. The institutions and the system is almost more or less is the same.
But Kurds are very different, aren't they? I mean, Kurds have a very different, relationship between men and women, equal, and so forth, and women taking part in society. But you escaped and made your way to England through lots of different smugglers.
Yeah.
And then went back to help in the battle with IS. Explain how you did that.
Well, I was left with no choice when I left Iran. It was not something that I wanted. It was, I didn't really want to leave my family, my friends. I was so connected to my family, to my friends, to the nature, but I had to. I would have ended up in prison for life, or I would be, I could be hanged. Iran is one of those countries who's still practicing hanging. If you don't believe in God, they would easily can label you unbeliever and allows them to hang you. So. Yeah, I was left with no choice at the time, and then when I came to Europe, I learned many things in the new environment, in the new country, and I had the privilege to many things. But then there was something wrong. I felt there was something missing. And then, as later on, I discovered that it was to share it with my people, to share it with my friends, to share it with my neighbors, with my family, the freedom and the rights that I had, to share it with them. So, initially, when I went to Rojava in 2013,
the area of Kurdistan, yeah,
I went for a project. There was confederalism, democratic process in practice in Rojava. So I was so inspired by the idea. So it was for the first time, people would make decision that concerns themselves, because in Middle East, until now, they have been ruled by dictators and
so
elite.
You go back, and then you find yourself having to take up arms against IS when you went back for the project, and then you end up battling IS.
Yeah, there was this decision to fight. To take a part in the army was the consequences of the earlier decision to be part of the system, to be part of the project. But then I took a responsibility. I saw. Well, it was in the gate. It was right. They were attacking the city that I was trying to help. We were already under embargo. We were already having difficult things, and we had health issues, education issues, anything, you name it. It's just the country has been through war and has been always treated differently by Syrian regime. So and you have ISIS, you have these extremists with this they are not attacking, they are massacring, they are committing genocide. And it was just, I made a decision to take a part, to take responsibility and stand. Not only me, there were mothers and there was fathers.
And you, in the book, you detail very, very brave people who died in battling IS. But you, partly because of being in the Iranian army, had skills that you could then develop, and you became a very, very skilled sniper.
I'm not sure if it was because I was in the Iranian army. Yes, true, I learned some skills, the basic skills, but the main skill, it develops by practice in front. There was no time to go to theoretical and training a lot. When I had a training for like 3 weeks, then I was good at shooting. So
you were one of 5 snipers in the area who could shoot at a mile distance. And you became very good, I understand from the book, reading the book, at fixing weapons, taking your weapons down, moving stealthily, working out what IS was doing.
This is like anything else is about practice. And we learned it in a difficult way, like straight away we went to front. Some people, because they didn't have the skill and they didn't have enough training, they lost their lives. But this is what it is. This is Rojava, this is Syria, and things are not going normally. When you have normal training and you go to go to war.
Yeah, when David was talking about the problems of IS snipers taking out, and Assad's own snipers taking out individual parts of the body. I mean, from a sniper's point of view, you write in the book very eloquently that you can see your victim and you can almost give your victim a character at great distance, but they can't see you. And I wonder, when you had to start killing people because they would otherwise kill women and children, what did you have to get a mindset that you're able to do that?
Of course, I had my reasons. I have had my peace with it, what I was doing, because it was very clear that if they wouldn't have been stopped, they may have walked in Berlin or Paris. So it was not the Kurdish issue, it was humanitarian issue. I was not the only one who took part. We have 7 British-born people who lost their lives in this battle. But going back to David's, he makes this point that he was treating this wounded. There was a pregnant woman who'd been shot. Yes, the snipers, they play game because they have the skill and they observe and they know what's going on, and it becomes this observing and controlling the situation. Like you can hold the army, but just watching. They cannot get close. If you just hide somewhere with a rifle, they cannot get. So you are very, very effective, and this kind of things, it gives you this game psychology. But in this particular case, when to play this kind of game, to shot some people in a particular part and take a pleasure of inflicting pain on in someone, like taking a pleasure in someone's adversity, then that is something. This is morally is wrong. You have to, as a sniper, you have to have huge moral standards. You have a good skill. You know how to use weapon, but you have at the same time have to great moral standards to how to use it and when to use it. But these people, they use it against pregnant women.
But what you were doing and your colleagues were doing, particularly in Kobani, was pushing IS back against all the odds. You were outnumbered, but you managed to push them back. And what I think in the book you're saying is the early work that the Kurds did allowed the international coalition to come in. Actually, the Kurdish work that was done early was very important.
When they came, the operation itself, it was so big, it was bigger than us. And they said, the mother of creativity is the need. So we need to survive. We need to fight back. And we were surrounded in 3 fronts, and we just, there was no, at the time when I arrived, there was no there was no stopping them. There was no pushing back.
And you pushed them.
Just resisted.
You pushed them back street by street eventually. But I wonder, you have written this book, and I wonder, it's clear that you suffered a great deal because of what you saw, and I wonder how you've coped with that now. I mean,
just I want to make this point about the resistance.
Sure.
There was the turning point in the fight against ISIS. We had no choice but to resist them, and we just said, we will leave the people, we will leave the Kurdish people a legacy of resistance. Because that was it. We were not imagining anything of fighting back or pushing them out, but we just said we don't have, this is the last street, this is the street of honor, and we should not step back from this street. And that was this decision that gave us the hope and the strength to fight back. And then, now we see where ISIS is. It started in the city of Kobane, and it started from this point.
But it's still, it's out, but ISIS has not disappeared. And I want to come on to Joana now and talk particularly, because you've been doing a lot of work on women and de-radicalisation. And you say that the UK has got dangerously old-fashioned idea about female IS affiliates. What do you mean?
I don't think it's necessarily the UK. I think this is generally a perception around the world. And so, up until last year when we conducted this research, nobody had systematically looked at a global level at the number of women that had joined the organization, that had become affiliated with the organization. And this is something that it's very problematic in our field generally. But what that meant was that there were at least 4,700 women that felt that they no longer belonged in their community, and there were a number of other motivations that pushed them out. But also that meant that ISIS they were extremely methodical and very effective at being able to communicate and recruit women in ways that we hadn't seen before. And that is something that we had overlooked and neglected. And now we are left with a situation where we have thousands of these women that now they demand that we deal with them, whether that, and this is something that's currently a point of major debate. But again, if we consider the number of women that went and prospects going forward, until we bring these individuals back, until we manage them, until we potentially prosecute and de-radicalize where appropriate, this is going to continue to be a concern for the next generation.
Because we have all these children from all over the world, and you see these pictures in the refugee camps of blonde-haired children, red-haired children, freckled children. You realise that we have this, as it were, this global problem of kids. I've got a book coming out in June that looks at how U.S. counterterrorism has evolved since 9/11, and one thing that has become explicitly clear to me is that the actions that we take in these moments of shift have long-term consequences and implications that will last far beyond 1 month, 6 months, 1 year. And we're at one of these points right now where if we do not manage adequately and effectively the women that went and joined this organization, the children that have been born into it, that have experienced a sense of community and identity that is affiliated specifically with this organization, we are now dealing with an intergenerational problem that will come back in ways that we do not yet understand. You say in your paper that no other terrorist group has offered women such diverse and fulfilling range of opportunities. I mean, it seems such an extraordinary kind of prosaic, like a civil service, but actually, what were women actually doing?
So Islamic State presented themselves as a state-building project, the idea that they were building a caliphate, a state and they stated that Muslims from around the world should come and join it. But to do that, you think about the kind of structures or institutions that a state has: education, healthcare, governance, policing, and within these, because of the gender segregated nature of the organization, they required women to come and deal with this. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's been very interesting to be across from David here, because in this case, we actually saw women going recruited as doctors and medical personnel for Islamic State. It's incredible.
So they had a full society. The idea is you're building a full society.
They portrayed that women could go over and have meaningful roles in this organization in a way that we hadn't seen before. And this is something that we have neglected to understand, and that has to be understood if we are to prevent this again from going forward and to manage these populations today.
So we have women that went over, radicalised before they went and further radicalised when they went, but not so many. Were they actually fighting laterally?
there were women in things like policing units, for example, the Al Hansa Brigade, and there were cases where we did see some women, a smaller number compared to the majority of those that went, that did engage in combat roles over there, or, for example, became suicide bombers like we saw in places like Raqqa. But I think one thing that's quite interesting to consider now is if we look at different plots or attacks that have been perpetrated around the world that have been either inspired by Islamic State or have had some kind of connection to Islamic State, the women that have been involved in these cases have not necessarily been ones that have returned from Iraq and Syria. They have been ones that have been in their country, they've not left, but they've been inspired by or decided to take action from their home base on behalf of the group.
So do you think there's a danger that what you do if you keep people like Shamima Begum away is that you create these kind of figures, these idols for future Islamic State adherents?
I think so. And one of the narratives that you saw IS really using a lot was the idea that you didn't belong in your society, that they were offering a society or a place in that society, an identity there that gave people a sense of belonging. And so when you look at the kind of discourses around citizenship now and the idea that people don't belong in those societies, it does give some kind of credence or strength to those kind of narratives.
Yeah, what do you do about that, Claire? Do you think? I mean, that whole idea that these women have a role that they didn't have in other societies around the world.
Did they actually get to fulfill any of those roles once they got there? They did. They did. Well, that's something to attend to, isn't it? How we're looking after our own citizens and what hopes we're breeding in them that are not being met here.
And when you go, David, you'll see this for yourself and you'll see these women and children. So what are you expecting to have to do when you get there?
I think there's a lot of, when you always get to refugee camps and so on, you do see lots of post-conflict injuries. And so there's lots of plastic surgery to do, there's lots of burns to do and things like that. And if you set up a little clinic, within about 2 or 3 hours, you'll get inundated.
Well, thank you to all my guests this morning. Joana Cook, Senior Research Fellow at the International Centre for the Study of De-Radicalisation. Claire Foster-Gilbert's lecture on Can Institutions Be Just is at the Westminster Abbey Institute tomorrow. David Nott's War Doctor, Surgery in the Front Line, and Azad Koudi's Long Shot, My Life as a Sniper and the Fight Against ISIS are both out now. And you can still hear David's story on Book of the Week via BBC Sounds. Next week, Andrew Marr looks at Maoism in China and abroad. But for now, thank you and goodbye.